Right, hello everyone. I wanted to talk to you and explain a little bit more about the process of shading. So shading is basically where you take your contour drawing, or a drawing that is just basically like how you would find a coloring book, where you just have your outlines of very important details. And whenever you add your shading, that's when you get the dimensionality of understanding that this is a three-dimensional object that's just being trapped on a two-dimensional surface. So a couple important things that I like to talk about with shading and just drawing in general before we even jump into the demo and get started is whenever you're working with a drawing, I like to think of drawing as a timeline. So this is our drawing timeline. There are different stages that you go through in creating a drawing. So your first stage is 2D design. In 2D design, you're thinking about what you're going to draw. So you're thinking about your composition, where things are going to be placed in space. If you're using your surface correctly by using most of your picture plane, not drawing something tiny right in the center. So this is just where you're kind of figuring things out, thinking about your positive, your negative shapes, making sure you're picking a subject that you'll enjoy working on for a while. From two-dimensional thinking, you start to work with gesture. So gesture drawing is a very loose way of basically sketching out what you want to sketch onto your page. So a gesture drawing is kind of putting down your most basic parts, and then you kind of fix it and it moves into a contour drawing. So gesture drawing, say if I were to draw an apple right now very quickly, I'd have my ground, you'd sketch in your apple just, very quickly, very loosely, and that would be kind of a gesture drawing. But as you work on it, you sight through the apple or draw your imaginary lines and see where objects line up. You're going to eventually keep working on fixing those lines and correcting the problems that you see. And then your drawing eventually builds into what's called a contour drawing, which with the contour drawing, it's very sure, dark outlines that you see, and your edges become more correct. So kind of just darkening things up. If I had a longer amount of time, this drawing developed from a gesture drawing into a contour drawing, and then I added values in my last step. I wish I had a video of it. But this started as a gesture, so I was drawing my dog very loosely, very quickly. From a gesture drawing, you build into what's called a contour drawing. So with a contour drawing, I like to explain them as kind of like a picture book, or not so much picture book, but more of like a coloring book, where you have very sure dark lines and you know where everything is placed and it's correct. So a contour drawing is basically just a black and white drawing with just your lines kind of showing where things are. So in a contour drawing, which is what this is, in a contour drawing, your lines tell you where things are. Whenever you move into the last stage, which is value, and with value, that's where we talk about shading, your light sources, highlights, shadows, things along those, a core shadow. Value is when the lightness and darkness tells you where things are. So for instance, again, contour, the lines kind of tell you where things are. With value, you don't really see any of the lines anymore. So I don't know if I can zoom in here, the value, or like these dark areas of the drawing, are showing you, where the edges of the nose are, where highlights are incorporated, where the tops of the eyes are, tops of the ears. It helps to differentiate pieces of your subject from your background. So being able to shade and understand value is a really important piece of any type of drawing. And it can be rather difficult to understand. So that's why I'm going to try my best to explain it to you, hopefully, remotely through this video. So I'm going to put this aside for now because I don't need that. And then I wanted to flip this over. So what I went ahead and did was I drew a couple of shapes to illustrate a couple different concepts. I have a little list with me of things that I want to talk to you guys about too. So the first thing is the very basics of shading. So paying attention to your light source, building your pencil from light to dark. You can work in sections, which I think I'll get to more whenever I start to shade in the leaf. And then paying attention to like shadow shapes and stuff. Your goal for a successful drawing is to have lights, darks, and a lot of different shades of gray in between. So sometimes beginners, whenever they're shading, they tend to have a lot of grays that look a lot the same. You want to make sure you have a good range of value. So whenever I go ahead and start to explain value, a couple of things that you want to do is make sure that you layer. You want to layer your pencil marks. You want to pay attention to the light source. I'm just going to make it LS for this. And the next really important thing is making sure that you follow the form. So right now what we have are shapes. Shapes are flat, two-dimensional objects, and of course it's on a two-dimensional surface. To take a shape and turn it into a form, you have to add shading. So whenever I say about following the form, this is what I mean. So for instance, for this one, I won't follow the form. So if I'm shading this in, saying this is my light source, so I have a light coming from the top left corner onto my shape. I'm going to twist it just to make it a little bit easier. If I start to shade this in, and I just go flat, but still kind of pay attention to the value, this shape is going to look flat. So even if I go across and just shade it in like normal, this shape is going to stay very flat. Okay, so again, just shading it in. And you could obviously tell what shape it is, but it's not getting the dimensions that you want. So if you follow the form, shading by following the form, you're actually going to have to curve your lines. So I drew a cone shape on purpose to do that. I mean, you could even do it with a cylindrical shape, which is, you know, obviously a flat shape on this paper, but you can make it, give it the illusion of holding a form by adding the shading. So if I were to shade this again, I would kind of curve my lines to follow the form of the shape and work very slowly. I understand I'm getting like some color outside of the lines, but eventually I'm going to build up my value. So I'm starting kind of darker at the bottom, lighter at the top. You can already kind of tell that that's looking a little bit more dimensional. I'm going to add a little bit of shading on the side. Now what I'm doing here is I'm doing what's called cross hatching. So cross hatching is where you take lines and then you layer lines over the opposite way as well. So in doing cross hatching, you could get darker values, but you could also kind of cover up these like a scratchy line texture that I see a lot in like early drawings. And that's why I kind of want to talk to you guys about it early on. If you use cross hatching, you could get a way smoother surface than just going one direction over top of things. So as I'm working with a pencil, I work in layers. I build the layers up. I don't go too dark too soon. If you push down too hard on your pencil, you do what's called burnishing the paper. And if you have had me in learning colored pencil before, or even just still lifes in general, you'll know that burnishing is whenever you actually push down the tooth of the paper. So our paper, even though we can't see it and it's a very smooth thing, paper has a tooth to it, which is basically microscopically like a little wave or like a sharp edges. Whenever you burnish down the paper, you push that tooth down and the paper won't accept any more pigment. So whenever you draw with a pencil, it leaves behind little particles, and which is captured in the tooth, and that's how you get the color to stay on your paper. But if you push down too hard, if somebody's too heavy-handed, that's going to burnish your paper. You won't be able to erase it fully. You won't be able to add color over top of it. So you need to be really aware and just work lightly. You could, as you're still working on your drawing and you want it to go a little bit darker, you could apply a little bit more pressure. And by doing that, and still following form, of course, by doing that, you could start to slowly add in these darker values. So I'm working the opposite way now, working horizontally as opposed to vertically. And I'm still following the form, so using a slightly curved line, just to blend this in a little bit more. And I'm still thinking about my light source. I know that right here is going to be the lightest area of my shape, so I want to be aware of that as I'm shading things in. And I'm not liking this line right here. This to me looks really harsh. So what I'm going to do is just go right over to this edge, darken it slightly. And as I'm moving over to that area where that line's pretty harsh, I'm just going to soften the pressure and create what's called a gradient. So whenever you're shading, gradients are really important. It's basically where you're using a lot of pressure, and as you're moving away from that area of dark, you're going to just lighten the pressure, which gives you a lighter line. So I'm almost done with this shape here. I'm actually going to go through and clean this up a little bit. Okay, I'm going to just darken in this little corner a little bit more. And do a final darkening just on this shadow area side. So again, just to kind of go through and review, make sure you layer your colors, work light to dark. You can always go darker, you can't always lighten things. You pay attention to your light source. Your light source is going to determine where things are going to be dark and where things are going to be a lot lighter. And make sure you follow the form. This could make or break your drawing, and you could already tell from me shading this in. I know this is very haphazard, but you could already tell from me shading this in flat as opposed to following the form. It does make a difference. So taking what we learned here and then applying it to something, so I'm sure you guys have seen people shade in objects before and they're like, great, that's fantastic, but what if we're shading in you know, an image of a person, or shading in something that isn't just a basic plain shape? So you could still take these rules and apply them to something else. So I went ahead and I found a reference photo of a monstera leaf. Let's see if I can find it here. So this is the reference photo that I found. It's a little tough to see on the document camera. The photo originally was in color, so it was, you know, different shades of green. What you might want to do if you're working from a reference photo is flip it black and white. And in doing so, you can see the dark values and the light values. You can see the total range of value without having to try to like guess when it's in color. So I might recommend doing that. I'm gonna set this over here for now and kind of work slowly from it. Whenever you go to start, so I sketched this all. It's just, again, a simple little leaf. When you go through and you finish your sketch, make sure you're happy with it. Make sure your lines are all cleaned up. And then I went ahead and paid attention to my light source. So I noticed in my reference photo that up and throughout here, that's where the highlight area is. So if there were a light source, it'd probably be coming from this tippy top left side. So I just indicated my light source. In your final drawing, you do not have to do that. I'm just doing this for tutorial and learning purposes. So it can be very overwhelming starting a drawing, especially with shading. So there's a couple of things or a couple of tips I could give you to kind of work through that. So one thing is to work in sections. So I might just continue this list, so forgive me. work in sections, because if you work in sections, it takes a big, huge problem and it breaks it down into little baby goals. That helped me out so much. So in that drawing that I showed you of the dog, which is my dog and I love her very much, in the drawing I showed you of my dog, I just kind of broke her up into little sections. I actually shaded in the background first before I even started shading her in, just to get a feel for everything and just practice a little bit before I just totally went for it. So I would pick sections to work in. Again, layering, keeping your pencil light to dark, which I should probably write that here. So you want to work light to dark. Okay. You're going to want to build up your layers. That's so, so important, and that goes for simple shapes, but it also goes for complex forms as well. We're going to pay attention to our light source, and then I'm going to talk about things called shadow shapes, which will help you shade things in a little bit more accurately. So again, your goal is to have a wide range of values. So you want really bright lights and really dark darks, and then a whole bunch of different shades in between. So we want to make sure that we have that. And we also want to keep in mind to cross hatch and make our pencil lines smooth. So we want to make sure that we cross hatch, and then we want to make our lines disappear. So whenever I first drew this shape up and throughout here, this cone shape, again, it was in the contour stage, so the lines were telling you where things were. Whenever we added value, do you notice how those lines disappear? Okay, and that's going to be super important too later on. So we want to do cross hatching slash make the value. We want to make the value absorb the lines. So if I were to go ahead and start to attack this, you want to start by adding in a layer of value everywhere. So this image here, it ranges more on like the darker side, but there are some lighter areas of color, and again, it's super hard to see. It's probably really poopy on the document camera, but there's some lighter grays and throughout the highlight area, through the center, and more on the right side. And then you have these super dark shadows here. So I know that no matter what, everything's going to be at least a light shade of gray. So I'm going to start again working light to dark. So I'm going to just take my pencil. I'm going to pick an area. Maybe I want to start, I'll start over here since there's a lot going on where the highlight is and where it moves into shadow. So I'm just going to start in this area and begin to shade. So following the form, I'm using curved lines. And I'm working very lightly. I'm hardly pressing down on the pencil at all. And you're just going to start to add in your first layer of value. And you could work with cross hatching to kind of smooth those lines out. But this area up here, that's going to be where our highlight is. So I don't want to make it too dark. So always have your reference photo out so you could go back and forth between it. Okay, so I'm just keeping it soft. Now, if I'm working just up in this section, which is kind of this piece of the leaf right here, I'm actually going to finish. I'll just work on this whole section. It kind of looks like a bird's head right here. Boop, boop, boop. So I'm going to go ahead and shade this section in, and then I'll talk to you about shadow shapes and darkening things. So just using the same pencil, I'm going to work the same way, adding in my first layer of value. You want to make sure that your pencil's sharp. You don't want to hold it all the way up to the tippy top. If you do that and you start to shade, you're going to have really inconsistent shading where it'll be, you know, really dark in some areas and really light in others. So you want to make sure that as you're shading, that you're kind of holding your pencil really far back. I don't know if you could tell on mine, but I'm holding it almost at the very end and just kind of holding my pencil on a stable surface, so it's resting on the table. And then I am just working on adding in my first layer of value right now. I will warn you, whenever you're working on a drawing, it doesn't matter if you're using graphite, if you're using pen and ink, if you're using charcoal, it's probably going to look a little rough before you get to where you're happy with it. So just trust the process. It can be so frustrating. I've had people in the past that pick something and they're super excited about it and then they're over it. So just make sure that you're happy about your subject, and also just trust the process a little bit too. Okay, so I went through and I added very lightly my first layer of value, and again, I'm just working in this little section right now, which is going to be the highlight area. So what I'm going to do next is go back to my reference photo. I'm going to actually zoom into this section where I'm focusing on, and I'm noticing that towards the top of the leaf, which would be here, it's a little bit darker. So whenever, we're already working in our sections, for shadow shapes, you could start to really look and pick apart your reference photo, or if you have your own photo that you've taken, or if you're working from life or from a still life, that's great too. But you really want to start to pick apart the values. So I'm still using the same pencil, but I'm going to start to add in, there's almost this like weird little leaf shape up through the top. Feel free that if you have to, if it makes you feel more comfortable, don't be afraid to move your drawing around. That helps out a lot, actually. So my reference photo, I'm going to add in this area, just like it is over here. So I'm going to just slightly push down a little bit harder, and I'm going to add my second value on. If you have drawing pencils at home, you can work with different types of pencils. Right now I'm just using an HB drawing pencil, which is basically the same as any pencil that you would get at a store. It's normally an HB lead. So you could have a good range of value with this. Just make sure your pencil's sharp, that you stay with that. But you can use different drawing pencils. So there's H pencils, which has a harder lead and leaves a lot lighter of a line. So if you were to draw something light, say like an egg or something, I would use an H pencil because of the hard lead. But there's also B pencils, which the B in the pencil stands for black. So you can kind of tell this is a 3B pencil, this is a 5H pencil. The 5H has a lot lighter of a line, where if you use the 3B, it just naturally is a lot darker. I normally use the B pencils for shading. So if you wanted to take your drawing to the next level, I would really consider the type of tool that you're using as well. So I'm going to go back to my reference photo, and this is getting darker, but it's nowhere near the value that I need. But that's okay. I'm going to kind of slowly develop this. You don't want to have it like be perfect right at perfect right now. If you've ever seen a Polaroid picture develop, that's exactly how you want your drawing to develop. So basically you're going to add a value all over, then you're going to slowly build that value until you get to where you want. And that's what people have issues with. They want it to be perfect right now, and that's not the case with drawing. It's not the case with painting. It's not the case really with a lot of things. So you have to be patient and really just like work with the process. So I'm noticing down and throughout here, there's almost like this triangle shape. And again, that's paying attention to our shadow shape. So I'm going to go in where it seems like this triangle shape starts here. It follows this line down, but it also has a little piece on this side where it's darker too. So I'm going to go ahead and just push down a little bit darker, a little bit harder, and I'm going to fill in this space. Now again, holding the pencil down towards the back, so then that way it's not too dark and it's more consistent. And I'm working almost in like little circles. I know it's like tough to see, but I'm working with little tiny circles to try to make a really soft shade, as opposed to like pressing down really hard and getting these harsh lines. You want to be able to build it, and you can't build it if you have those really harsh lines in it, because again, you'll burnish your paper and kind of ruin it before you get started. So you'd have to actually restart if you're doing that. a lot of drawing, and you'll kind of notice this more as you work on, different projects throughout the class. But a lot of drawing is just noticing things, noticing weird things, and then just being able to put it down onto paper. I don't think drawing takes, I mean, obviously there's a certain amount of technique and skill that you have to learn, but if you have a good eye at paying attention for things, and if you're good at citing and measuring, you could draw anything that you want, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going through and I am going back to my reference photo. So again, I like to almost think that this is like a Where's Waldo, or like a spot the difference in pictures. So normally if I were in class with people, I would sit right beside them and look at their reference photo or look at their reference image and go back and forth in between the drawing and the reference photo. And obviously you could look at this value and look at that value and be like, heck yeah, that's way darker than what I have. So you need to like build those layers a little bit more. Another thing is this line, this vein right here in the leaf is actually really light, and then there's a really dark area above it. So I'm actually going to change my pencil out. So I was using an HB. I'm going to jump into, let me see here, I have a 2B here that needs sharpened a little bit. So I'm going to use a slightly darker pencil, and then I'm going to go back in and just start to add in the that really dark edge along this vein right here. And then I'm going to just softly fade that up, so almost creating a gradient going up. So instead of it going this way, I'm just slowly moving it up. So I'm pushing down, almost non-existent, to fade that into the color that's already there, because I went from an HB all the way to 2B, so that is kind of quite of a jump. Then I'm going to go back down and throughout here, and I'm going to work on darkening that value. And again, it's kind of tough to see through the document camera. There is a lot more subtleties that are on here that you can't really see with it being filmed through there. But you could at least see the basis of the value. So I'm just going in here, slowly layering that on top. Now do you notice how it goes from dark and it kind of like fades into this lighter value right here? So I'm going to darken it on this edge and just lighten it as I'm moving over here, so less pressure as I'm moving over there. Sometimes you'll get these weird little wonky edges because you don't want to like color outside of the lines. If you get those edges, just go back to them and just do some lines that go the opposite way. Do a little bit of cross hatching there, and that will help to smooth that color out, and it won't give you those weird little scratchy edges. So this edge right here, I'm looking at this shadow shape, and it actually comes up a little bit higher than how I had it. So I'm going to just move this sideways, darken here a little bit more, and then fade this color up. So then that way I'm still following my reference photo and still trying to use that for accuracy. Okay. And then up and throughout here, that's still a lot darker of a value, so I'm just going to go back through again and just slowly build it. Now, in some areas where you think that you need to lighten, you could use your eraser if you need it to be a bright white color. This, in my case, it's actually not pure white. Make sure that you look at that and really evaluate your reference photo before you decide to make something pure white. A lot of times, things with pure white highlights might be, say if you're doing a still life of glass bottles, glass always has like a pure white glint to it wherever the highlight is. But with this being a leaf, I mean it is a waxy leaf, so there might be a pure white highlight, but this to me even just looks like a light shade of gray. So I would just be aware of that whenever you're adding in your highlights. You could either just keep your values light in those areas, or you could use your eraser as a tool and just kind of bring some of those colors back in if you want. I don't see this as like a mistake eraser, I see it as a tool, so you could use it kind of back and forth with your pencil. So the highlight area is more in throughout here, so I'm going to just shade this in a little bit more. I see that there's like an even darker area right here, so I'm just going to go through and just darken that piece. So the shadow shapes, even though they're not always like a perfect circle, a perfect square, they do really help in trying to make your drawing look a little bit more realistic, because obviously a leaf that you find on the ground probably has some type of like a it might be a little misshapen. They're not always perfect. They might have little dark blotches on them. So any little piece that you could find and add into your drawing is just going to make your drawing that much better. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and then I'll let you guys be on your merry own way, is this final detail here. So I have the piece of the leaf. It's drawn right here, but I don't know if you can see from your angle, but there is a, I don't know if you can see, there is like a dark line right above and right below this vein of the leaf. So in order to follow my reference photo and make sure that I put all that stuff in, I'm just going to take my pencil and press a little bit hard right above where I drew that piece of the leaf. And then I'm also going to go right below it, because I want it to, I want this light value to pop. And in order to make light values stand out, you want to put dark values right beside light values. So I'm just going to very carefully add this in. Now, this shadow is very harsh at the bottom, meaning that it's probably just going to stay just one dark line. But this area at the top does have a slight amount of like fading going up. So I'm going to just go over this and then just lessen my pressure as I'm moving into that highlight area that's already there. Now, if you want sharp details, you need to make sure you have a sharp pencil. So I just went through and sharpened mine. But if you have a really dull pencil, you probably wouldn't be able to get the amount of detail or like the amount of line that you need. So just make sure you have a pencil sharpener handy. Just going to go through and darken this up a little bit more. And then the last thing is just to make sure you notice any little details. So I know that I'm probably going to have to go in. Here's actually a 6B pencil. I'm going to have to go in and really darken these edges, because they are a lot darker in value than how I have them on my drawing. So you want to make sure you do any final finishing touches. Now, if I had more time and I were working on this drawing very seriously, I wouldn't just develop this one section. I would develop everything all at one time, and then just slowly kind of work my way to these detail areas. But since I'm just trying my best to explain some important concepts while not taking up your whole entire life, I would like to just work on this little piece here. But using different types of pencils really help you get that value that you want a lot faster. And of course, building in those layers. So all I'm doing right now is just going in and adding my final like really dark darks. And then there are some other details in the leaf that I'm just going to very subtly add in. Like there's some extra lines that are in there, and again, you guys probably can't see it, but it is important to pay attention. Again, any little detail that you could add in to make it look that much more realistic, do what you can. Okay, so again, this looks darker on the video, but I went through and I darkened it to the best of my ability. I actually went through and kind of burnished the edge of this paper, so that's about as dark as this pencil will go. But right now, I have really dark darks, I have some light areas, and shades of gray that are in between, so I'm happy with that. So I'm going to jump back to, let me see what this is, there's a 2B pencil. I'm going to jump back to the HB pencil, and I'm just going to draw some random little lines that kind of follow my reference photo, just to add like the final little touches. Now these lines are very, they're not perfectly straight. They have like a varied line weight to them. So instead of them being straight across lines, you might want to, if you're drawing a leaf like me, if there is a darker area, you might want to shade that in a little bit darker and then, you know, go and then add a little bit of darkness. So I'm just going to go in and add a couple more lines. So I am happy with that end result. Hopefully that helped you guys out a little bit in understanding shading a little bit more. Just to review, so the making sure that you layer your pencil from light to dark, so you're able to achieve that full range of value and not go too dark too soon, because you don't want to burnish your paper. Make sure you know where your light source is. Knowing the light source is so important, so you know where your light areas are and where some areas that are going to be in shadow are going to be. Follow the form, so then that way you can make it look like a three-dimensional form even though it's on a flat surface. Again, if you just kind of shade it in haphazardly, it's not going to give you that effect of it taking up space. If it helps you, work in sections, pick pieces, and just slowly build and develop those sections. But remember to work like a Polaroid picture where things kind of slowly develop over time. It's not going to be perfect right off the bat. It takes time. Pay attention to your shadow shapes. Those shadow shapes, again, aren't going to be perfect circles, perfect squares, perfect diamonds, but they will help you add in where, you know, some darker values are going to be or where some lighter values are going to be. And again, you could use your eraser as a nice tool. And then making sure you use cross hatching to keep your lines really soft, and then using the value to make these lines disappear. So you could kind of tell, if I can zoom in here, you could kind of tell that the sketch lines that I made are now being replaced by value. So it's almost like the value absorbs those lines. You don't want to see these final lines in your final drawing. Your value should just tell you where things are. Okay?